Okay, so we were talking about you had gone out to Indiana, to Detroit to see Radulovich,
Yeah,
and
Ann Arbor.
and
Yeah,
he was very firm
that
that
he
this is what
wanted
to
to
do,
do
and he had
this.
been railroaded by the Air Force.
He knew that if he came on the air and said something, that he would be attacked by people who felt that you know he was not a good person, and he wanted to present his position, and he was ready for the consequences.
So,
So I called up. I called friendly. I said, "This guy is terrific, and I think we should do him." And I said, "Get Charlie Mack out here. I didn't want to work with anybody else but Charlie on a story like that. Charlie was my dearest friend there at See It Now, and he also was a brake on me. If he thought I was going over the deep end or even approaching the deep end of the story, I said no, and I would listen to him because he was seeing me in action, and he wanted to make sure that I was doing it right.
didn't Fred ask you something about Radulovich, or about how well spoken he is?
I'm sure he did. I said he talks beautifully. I don't mean his enunciation. He's full of fire on the
Oh,
subject.
I remember the story as Fred saying, "How well did he speak?" and you saying he speaks better than you.
Uh,
Is that true?
it could be. I don't remember
Uh
that.
huh.
I do remember after we made the interview and all that, and I called Fred. I said, "What does he look like on the screen?" Because you never was sure that the camera was working operationally, and there would be scratches in the film, and the sound always something was wrong with it. We're working with 35 millimeter equipment that was designed to take 4 minutes of a picture with sound if you were lucky. And that was it. Then you would stop it and check your lenses and check the motors and the gears and the blah, blah, blah. I said, "What does it look like?" He said, "You're fired, I'm fired, and Ed Murrow is fired. And we're going to have the greatest show in the history of television. Greatest broadcast." We never used the word show because that was too much Hollywood. But it was a wartime expression that the British had. A good show, when they bombed something.
Now you went around town to check up on how people would respond to Radulovich,
Yes.
and you were surprised, weren't you?
I went, obviously, to find people not only who liked him, but I wanted people who didn't like him, who thought that he was not right for the Air Force. I figured that the police chief of the town would have certain reservations. This police chief was like Gary Cooper in High Noon. He thought it was, in effect, a disgrace what they were doing to Milo, that there was no evidence, no nothing, and this is not the way that law and order. I don't remember the word for word, unless you want me to read it.
No, it's okay.
And then I was sure when I went into the bar, I said, "Anybody here know about the Radulovich case?" "Yeah, we all know about that goddamn case." I said, "Anybody here want to talk on television?" This burly guy with a scruffy, unshaven face and kind of bloated from good drinking and a beer barrel belly. He said, "I'm head of the American Legion post here, and I'll talk to you." I said, "Thank God I got a guy who's going to tear him apart." He said, "If they can do that to him, they can do that to me without any evidence and the railroad." And, if we had him alone, it would have been a surefire bet. So I didn't find anyone, and the Air Force begged them, give us somebody to talk. No, they wouldn't. And meantime, back in New York, I guess somebody like Johnny Aaron or Jesse Sassberg was checking the Air Force, trying to get the documentation, and they finally got it. They may have gotten it from the lawyer. I was not privy to that. I don't remember bringing that stuff back, the actual testimony, informants against him. But Fred told me subsequently there were two officers that the Air Force sent down to talk to Murrow. High ranking, not a general, but a colonel, maybe a full colonel, lieutenant colonel. And they tried to talk Murrow out of using the peace because it would be deleterious to the Air Force and hold them in low esteem and blah, blah, blah. And Murrow listened to them, heard them out. He knew what the argument was until they get to the point, we've been very nice to you in the past, and we would like to be able to continue to be nice, providing jets for stories and things like that. And I don't know if they brought up the question that Murrow's brother was a general in the Air Force, because I heard that later from McCarthy's people, using that as a threat when they were getting ready to go against McCarthy. But he did have a brother with a fancy name, Lacey, Lacey Murrow, who was an Air Force general, whom I met on a story. When I knew that he was the guy in the story, I was doing a parachute drop in Texas, and in comes this guy. I meet him in the bathroom at 4:30 in the morning, getting ready to go out on the trip. And I look at him, and I hear his voice. I said, Jesus, this is Edward R. Murrow. No, it can't be. It's his brother, General. Except he was about half the size, or so it seemed to me. A good head shorter than Ed was. And he says, is there anything I can do for you and all that? I says, absolutely nothing. I wanted no connection with him, because I was very sensitive to the business of, we don't get favors. We don't take favors from the government. If we need a plane in a scene and the plane is there, and if they let us use it, that's no favor. That's part of the news operation. But I wanted no favors, which was wrong, because he would have sent the film back immediately by jet that was going back to New York. But
So these generals the Air Force people tried to put pressure on Ed.
That was a gentle pressure, and Murrow, the more you pressured him. See, with Murrow, if you asked him for his shirt, he would give you his shirt. But if you demanded something of him, he was implacable. You were the enemy. He wouldn't tolerate anybody. You've got to do this. Well, that was the red flag for Murrow.
So he basically sent them out of the office and went ahead with the story.
They,
Now, so since I'm also interested in how these stories get pieced together, you get your film from out in Ann Arbor. What do you do? What did you do next? You come home with the film?
I did come home, I believe, on the weekend, because we worked day and night, like 17 setups or more, moving all that equipment around. And I would come back, and I think, I'm in a haze about this because it's so whacked out, that I would see what they had, a little bit of it. I didn't see the full thing. Then they would run, frequently, they would run the full thing. If I was in New York, I would see the full piece that they had edited. And it was important enough to Murrow, he would be there too.
Where was the editing room?
It was on, I believe, 555 or 550 Fifth Avenue.
So it was a few blocks away from where CBS was.
More than a few, yeah. We were still working, I think, at 485 Madison. And, we were working at 485 Madison. And the editing rooms where we actually cut the film, where the editors cut the film, was over on Fifth Avenue. It was about a 10-minute walk or a run if you couldn't get a cab. And they were always late, and getting on the air was like hairbreadth Harry. You didn't know if we were going to make it the air. They were still editing until, Fred, grab the thing and let's get out of here. And because he had to go over now to Grand Central Terminal where they put the film on. I was not privy to all of that. I saw it once or twice.
So the film would come, you came in from the Midwest with your film.
On that story.
It then goes to...
Well, they already had the film. I didn't come in
with the
bearing the film.
How did it come in?
Oh, by airplane. We would go down to the cameraman would either himself or send his sound man to the airport, and they would put it on the airplane with a waybill number, and they would call the office and tell them what flight it was coming in on, and then the people in New York would be out there to meet the plane, meet the flight, and bring it back. They would bring it back to the laboratory, where then it would have to be developed overnight, and they would get the film the next day.
And then that film would go to the editing room.
Editing rooms.
And
now, the soundtrack, originally the soundtrack was on the 35 millimeter, but it was an optical soundtrack. It was a picture of sound going down. So sound was very poor generally in newsreel cameras, and they would take that sound off and put it on a tape like what you see today, videotape, to run concurrently with the picture. They would sync it up, S-Y-N-C-H, synchronize it, so that the sound and the picture came out together. Then they would be able to cut picture, throw away parts that were unnecessary, and have narration or the voice over of the person who was talking about something or other. You would see that something or other. It was a very tricky thing. Today, the videotape comes in, there's no cutting of anything, you just punch buttons up, it's on a computer. You know down to the frame where you want it to switch over to he's talking and you're seeing a different picture than the guy talking.
So it would be coming in, so the editor gets assigned.
Right.
Did you have an editor that generally was assigned to your stuff?
No,
Or
no.
who got the Radulovich story?
I don't know. It could have been broken up. Stories, in other words, when you knew that you wanted to go with this story, and I think it was practically a half-hour story, you were going to do it that Sunday or the next Sunday, Fred would say, all right, you take the interview to one editor, take the interview with Radulovich, you take it with the father and the mother, you take it with the sister, you take it with the bunch of people who he has telling you what they think of Milo. I want you to come in no more than 8 minutes for Radulovich. I want you to come in no more than 3.5 for the people who are talking. I want you to do the father. I love the letter. Give me the full letter, 1.5 minutes. And so on and so forth. And some shots of the Air Force at Selfridge Air Force Base. These editors then would bring them all together, and Fred would be hovering over them in the way that Hewitt later did, but does not do it that way anymore. He generally stays out of the cutting room, except when he gets jumpy and he wants to see what his boys are doing. They would then bring them together. They would run it in the screening room, where you see a big screening room, which was deceptive because it never looked like that on television, on a big screen. But Fred would say, good, good, out, throw that out, very good, 4 minutes, bring it down to 1.5 minutes. And the editors always died with that, because they'd killed themselves to get it down to 4 minutes.
And then, if it was acceptable and if it was late and it was done, somebody would literally run it up down to across to Grand Central?
After the film was cut,
to
then
do the
you needed
narration.
the narration.
Right.
And Fred would either write it or somebody, Jesse, might write the narration. I would write notes that came in with the film, and they would work off that on the stories that I did. And I think all of us were doing it that way. But in the studio, Fred would either designate somebody to write narration to the sequences, and the narration wasn't that long. The powerhouse was in the people that you were filming. And then Murrow would look at it, and then he would decide what he wanted to say at the end, and or at the beginning. And he generally wrote that portion. He would dictate that to the secretary.
And that was the part that he was actually live on camera. All right, so now he has a sense of what he's going to do. The film is ready, and it's literally run over to Grand Central Station at
when
time?
the film, one last step.
I want to get over to
to
running to
meld
Grand
the
Central.
narration with the picture. That was done in that Fifth Avenue studio. With the sound man, I think someplace over in the control room, another 10 blocks away in Grand Central, and they would sync up the picture with the sound. The people in the editing room at Fifth Avenue would make sure that the sound was coming out of the mouth properly, because you would lose sync many times. And the guy at the other end was receiving the sound, Ed Gilly, that was the Ed I was talking about. He would say, Commander, because he'd been a commander in the Navy, do it again because the sound was down low, bring it up a touch, and he would control also the sound there. Then when they knew that they had it synchronized, then the stuff would be taken over. Now, the crucial moments of crisis where they had a race to get over there, those weren't every Sunday night or every Tuesday night, but they happened often enough to give people whatever you call that stuff, belly aches.
Right.
And I think on Radulovich, I don't know whether they got there in plenty of time, meaning at least an hour or 2 hours, to have a run-through. Murrow would be waiting on the night of the broadcast for rehearsal number 1. And I think Radulovich went off okay. But over at, now this is where Shirley would know a million times better than I did, at Grand Central, they had a studio, the control room. That's where you saw Murrow coming out. You didn't see Fred Friendly sitting under his knee, and Fred would be prodding Ed for coming in live at the precise moment. And he probably had his pencil with him, which was a dangerous weapon in Fred's hands, or the finger. And I think Fred at one time promised to kick him if he ever hit him with that finger again. It's like the Sunshine Boys, Walter Matthau and George Barnes, with the finger, you know.
Right.
But there was no other way to do it. You couldn't holler Ed now. You know, hit him. Well, some guys would have done it just right, tap. But Fred was stronger than that. And the rehearsal would go. Then they would do it again. The night of the McCarthy broadcast, they came out of the rehearsal, and Fred was fit to kill at least one person and maybe a dozen. The equipment had broken down during the rehearsal. It was out of sync. Everything was wrong, over which we had no control. We had brought them, or he had brought them, the final print, and it was perfect. And he came out in a fury. I could tell, you know, he didn't really look at you. He'd look at his eyes would rove. And I think he would have killed somebody if that second time on the air had gone wrong. I don't know what he would have done. I wouldn't have wanted to be there, but I was there. Murrow came at that rehearsal, and he said, "Boy, it's hot in there. And it's going to be a lot hotter around the country tonight when you're finished."
Where were you when the show? Did you go into the editing room to help them edit, or did they get you
If
out?
they
of it?
asked me to,
Right.
or I would really practically ask permission. I never touched a camera in all the years that I worked with cameramen. And I never touched the engineering equipment in all the years I worked with radio engineers, because they had a strong union, and you didn't touch equipment.
What was Charlie Mack's line about the union? About the
Once I asked him to shift lights to catch a shot of Senator Taft nodding away in a great big Coliseum Hall in Chicago, and Everett Dirksen, Senator Dirksen, was introducing him or talking about him as Mr. Republican, Mr. Integrity, the greatest man that the Republican has. And Taft may have just been listening, you know, and closing his eyes. But he also looked like he was nodding off. I said, "Charlie, get a shot of that." And he's way back here, you know, 50 yards away practically. He says, "I'd have to go around changing all these lights." And he said, "All right, pal, if that's what you want." Now, that was always the code. I'm going to the union with this complaint. And he was my dearest friend, and I loved him. He would have gone to union. He would have crucified me. So you didn't touch equipment. You didn't touch film. Fred, or Palmer Williams, who was second, we left out a very integral part of the whole See It Now operation. Through, again, Jap Good, Fred hired Palmer Williams, who had a considerable experience in documentary making outside. And he was brought in as the manager of all film operations, because he knew how to talk to editors, he knew how to talk to labs, and he knew how to talk to reporters, although the reporters kept them sort of a little bit at arm's length because this was their story. They knew what the story was like. But the film editors would tell him their complaints, and the labs would tell him what had gone wrong. There was a scratch down the film. And Palmer had to be as inventive as anybody in working his way around in airline schedules, getting planes, worked with Pan Am, had a separate deal going with them to get our film as priority wherever we were in the world, so to get the film back. He died over a year ago.
So you weren't transmitting film, you had to transport film.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Now,
I suppose you could transmit film if you went to the studio, but that came later, really.
where were you when the show aired? Would you watch it at home? Would you watch it from the studio?
Many times, I don't even know if I was at home. We would already be on the next story, running around the countryside.
Now, the first year or two, what kind of stories were you doing, generally? What were some of the stories that you recall? Without going into detail into the stories, what were some of them that you were doing?
I suppose coal mine or coal mining strikes. I went out once during the failure of a coal mine. It collapsed to do John L. Lewis. It was very hard to get, and he was willing to do it in a hotel room. He'd be on one phone, Morrow would be on the other in New York, and they would talk to each other. And my cameraman, I think Marty Barnett, would film John L. Lewis. And I remember Lewis saying, "How do you want the sentences, long or short?" And I say, "Sir, when we get the film, we'll edit it down." "The rhythm, man, the rhythm. Do you want it long or short?" I knew exactly what he meant, because Carl Sandburg would have said the same thing. If you want it long, then he will give you a rolling sentence. You want it short, you'll get a tough sentence.
What other stories were you covering?
Huh?
What other stories were you covering?
I'd have to go
What else
into
comes
the
to
book.
mind when
Well,
you think about
the big stories.
But
that,
before the McCarthy and before those stories were,
Yeah.
like the coal mine stories.
I'd
or
have to
the-
go back into the book.
All
By
right.
now, it's
All right.
you should have asked me before we went on. I would have had a listing.
What was the reaction to the Radulovich story in the general public and?
I think it was favorable, yeah. And the McCarthy crowd, of course, that was where the die was cast. McCarthy's sort of chief investigator, Don Serene, who knew me and I knew him, he said, "What kind of Radwitz junk you guys putting on?" I knew, oh boy, here it comes. I met him when J. Edgar Hoover was testifying on something or other at the Senate caucus room, and Radulovich grabbed me, Serene grabbed me and said, "What are you guys doing with that Radwitz junk?" I said, "Please, look, I got to get to the airport." He said, "What would you say if I told you Murrow was on the Soviet payroll?" I said, "What?" He said, "You come on with me." And we went up to his room. I stood in the hallway. He went in to the McCarthy's office, one of them, and he came out with a big front page, I think of the Pittsburgh Sun-Telegraph, 1935, I believe, and it was an attack on a professor at NYU in New York, George S. Counts, but it was also an attack on the Institute for International Education, which was an exchange group that Murrow had worked for as assistant director. And they were sending kids to all the countries around the world, including Germany, and they had a seminar or a summer session lined up for Moscow, and the Russian kids would come here, and this is normal procedure. And Murrow's name was down there. He says, I said, "So what has it got to do with Murrow and all that?" He says, "Well, this was subsidized by Vox, V-O-K-S, which was a Soviet instrument of government, and he was on their payroll getting the money." I said, "Come on, will you, for crying out loud. You guys, this is terrible, making these kinds of accusations." And we dillied and dallied for a while. He said, "Well, I'm not saying Murrow was a communist, but if he walks like one, talks like one, acts like one, the old aviary and zoology of anti-communism, then he's playing their game." So I said, I was really shaken. I said, "Do you mind if I take this back and show it to Mr. Murrow?" He said, "Go right ahead." Great largesse jerk. We would have had to find our own, and when we went looking for it in the Pittsburgh Sun-Telegraph, that page had been torn out of the files. I'm sure that one of the McCarthy boys had helped it along. So I showed it to Murrow that night. Well, this is a story for the whole Murrow broadcast.
Yeah.
And he had a bad cold. He was looking terrible. And he said, "So that's what they've got." And he looked at it and says, thing is, times are bad. He started making certain confessions to me. He said, I haven't been able to talk about the China situation at all. You know, what we do in China, where are we going there? But he was really shaken about this. And, so again, I was smart alecky, and I said, well, I'm sorry this is happening at this stage of your career because you should have been able to retire as a country gentleman by this time. He said, never mind that, you know, didn't need any cajoling from me. The next morning, I meet him at the water fountain on the 17th floor, and he was baring his teeth. He had not too good a set of teeth, and when he bared them, they looked like he was ready to chomp a bear. And he said, the question is, now, when do I go against these guys? He already made up his mind. And he had to figure out how much he could use of the air to go against Joe McCarthy,
So
what right he had.
This was the beginning of the McCarthy show.
That was, the decision to go with a broadcast about McCarthy. I'd done a number of them. I'd done Reed Harris being destroyed right before the committee. He had been a very fine director in the Voice of America, one of the radio station outlets, and McCarthy made it sound like he was deliberately preventing information from going out to the anti-communist world and ruined him completely. It was over a book that he had written at Columbia University 25 years before, King Football, which he said was the schools were commercializing sports. And that was a crime to say that, or that the family unit was no longer as strong as it used to be, and that was a crime.
You had also done Annie Lee Moss.
No, that would come the week after.
So what would you say was the importance of the Radulovich story?
I think it was the first jab at the whole loyalty security mania that was going on, but also a sort of a sidelong glancing blow at McCarthy and what he was doing, because what he was doing was exactly what you saw that the government was doing to Milo Radulovich.
A very important story in the history of broadcasting.
I think it was. Now, Fred would always say later on that that story, if we hadn't done Radulovich, we would never have done the McCarthy broadcast. I don't believe that for a minute. In other words, he's saying that gave us the courage to go on. No, we would have done the Murrow broadcast. Murrow always used to say, or Fred would say, if we had been able to do the Annie Lee Moore story, we wouldn't have done the McCarthy thing. I don't believe that either. I don't believe either with Don Hewitt that that broadcast, the Murrow-McCarthy broadcast, ended the McCarthy. That didn't end it. That opened him up. What ended it was the hearings that then went on, and Joseph Welch, the lawyer, said, never until this moment did I gauge your terrible...
What happened to Radulovich as a result of the story?
He got his, shortly, about 6 weeks later, somebody called Murrow while he was shaving at morning time and said, you ought to get a cameraman over to the Air Force in the Pentagon, because the secretary is going to have a statement to make that will be of interest to you, Harold Talbot. And he did have a statement to make, and it was that Radulovich was clear of all these charges and he was restored to duty.